Vladimir Putin invaded Chernobyl. I mean, I'm surprised, but it's not like we had evidence to go off to make any sort of real assessment this was happening. Like, we had satellite images of Russian troops massing on the border in numbers that were purported to be about the same as what has happened in the last 5 years or so. 2 or 3 times in the last 5 years, around 100,000 troops have massed on the border with Ukraine. So that was one indication. That was the only real indication. Everything else was just like, and most of the USA and the UK, like making claims, but not actually providing any evidence for the claims. So at least for what evidence was provided to the public, we really didn't have any reason to suspect that this was going to be worse than last time until Russia started massing more troops, which there was also at least reasonably decent proof of in satellite images as well. They went up to around 150, 180,000, according to the estimates at least. And then entered the breakaway republics. That's when it's like, okay, shit is going down now. But even the Ukrainians didn't think that that much more was going to happen. The Ukrainian president actually said 11 fucking days ago that he has yet to see convincing evidence to suspect that the Russians were actually going to mount a full-scale invasion. On the 13th of February, literally 11 days ago, the Ukrainian president said that there was a lack of convincing evidence. I don't know, it seems to me kind of like even the US, UK, etc. were not sharing, if they had accurate intel, which I still haven't seen a real indication of them having, because all of their like specific claims were proven wrong. Like they said, for example, that there was going to be an invasion on the 16th of February, which didn't happen. They said that Russia was going to try to justify it with like a really elaborate false flag terrorist attack with like pre-filmed acted videos and stuff. And they use words like crisis actor and stuff, and that didn't happen. If the US and UK had accurate intel, they didn't share it with the public, and they also don't seem to have shared it with the Ukrainians. There was very little reason to suspect that Russia would invade, at least not in a way that so complete. Like apparently they're on the outskirts of Kiev already. That is insane. That is completely insane. Putin is a fucking moron, honestly. And just before I move on from this article, it's like some people were saying like, oh, he was just downplaying the invasion because he didn't want to cause panic. Motherfucker. If he knew that Russia was going to invade in the next 11 days, he would not be downplaying the invasion. He would not be saying there was no convincing evidence. He would be fucking getting everyone ready for it. They seem to have been very unprepared. For one, the evacuation of Kiev only began after the fucking missiles started dropping. Literally yesterday. And for two, the Ukrainian government only 2 or 3 days ago instituted a general campaign of conscription. If they had reasonable intel that there was going to be a full-scale invasion 11 days ago when he said this, they would have done that far earlier. They would have been getting prepared far earlier. It might just be because their strategy doesn't involve defending the actual borders, but their borders were not defended at all. The Russians just rolled over them. Well, the borders in the contested areas were defended, but the borders with Russia and Belarus were not defended at all. And Russian tanks and troop transport just rolled over like they were empty. They really don't seem to have been well prepared for this. I mean, I'm sure they prepared in that they've had plans for a very long time, because every military has plans, contingency plans for even the most like unlikely scenarios. Obviously, Ukraine is going to have plans for a potential Russian invasion, which is a much more likely scenario than most of them are. But it doesn't seem like they were very prepared. And this is fucking awful. Putin, like, he's hurting himself. Obviously, he's not hurting himself as much as he's hurting Ukraine, but this is suicidal. It's absolutely suicidal. You can't rationally explain it. Realpolitik is dead. You can't explain this with any sort of, like, self-interest framework. None of this is within Putin or Russia's self-interest. You can say that he lost his mind, but I don't know, man. Putin has always had a reputation of being, like, ruthless but level-headed and calculating. Doesn't look like it to me. Like, honestly, this invasion has less logic than like the Nazi invasion of fucking Poland. Less like planning for like auxiliary effects than that. It doesn't make any sense at all. It's not populism either. You think the average Russian wants war with Ukraine? Absolutely fucking not. This is going to hurt Ukraine. I mean, this is going to hurt Ukraine the most, obviously. It's going to murder tons of Ukrainian civilians and cause tons of refugees, ruin the country, destroy it. But it's also going to hurt Russia. It's going to completely fucking destroy Russia, both economically, because obviously it's going to be sanctioned to some extent. General sanctions, definitely. Perhaps not the cutoff from SWIFT, but it's going to be sanctioned, whether we want it to or not. It's going to be ruined economically from that. You know, it might survive under a state of economic siege, basically, but its living standards are going to plummet. Its GDP is going to plummet. Its economy is going to go to shit. And geopolitically, Russia has just alienated itself even from some of its allies. You know, Russia was, for example, Russia doesn't really have a sphere of influence outside of Eastern Europe, but it has been trying to sort of engage more in Latin America, for example, in Africa, etc. They have just discredited themselves in every way possible. They're going to bring economic ruin on their own country, on Ukraine, on the states that are bordering it as well. There's no explanation other than just the most base form of barbarous nationalism imaginable. This is not something that anyone could have predicted based off the evidence that was available. You could have made a prediction, just said, oh yeah, they're definitely invading, based off no evidence, because there was no publicly available evidence. Unless you're a member of an intelligence agency who had access to the direct documents, you didn't see anything to indicate this. At least not until the last week or so. The Ukrainians obviously didn't either. That's why the president said that. So the people who are trying to gloat, being haha, I was correct and you're wrong. You weren't correct. You just made claims based off no evidence. Anyone can say oh, this is going to happen in the future based off no evidence, and then be oh yeah, I told you so when it does happen. It doesn't really mean anything, because you can do that and be wrong 9 times out of 10, but the one time that you're correct doesn't mean that you somehow made a good assessment of the evidence. Anyway, regardless of that, that's basically just internet personality clout shit. I don't think there's any way that you can look at this that's rational other than it's just ridiculous nationalism. Not even nationalism really, because I think even nationalism needs to be rational. You need to think okay, so we want to annex Ukraine. That's ours or something. That's how Putin thinks, not the Russians. Putin thinks, right? But he still usually has a reputation as a calm and calculated politician. And he should say, well, I want to take that, but I should do it in a way that isn't going to ruin my own country. Taking it isn't worth the fucking economic and geopolitical ruin of my own country. But he hasn't, he just fucking invaded it anyway. Even the fucking Nazis were more rational than that. When the Nazis invaded Poland, they did so knowing that there would be geopolitical consequences for them. They were prepared for them, right? They ensured that they were, self-sufficient enough that it didn't fucking matter if France and Britain declared war on them and they were economically sanctioned or whatever. In Russia's case here, there's nothing like that. It's all completely inexplicable. There's nothing here. I mean, you could say he has leverage over the only leverage that Putin has is gas. Gas, and to a lesser extent, oil and other forms of energy. But even then, what's going to happen here is that Europe is going to look towards other sources for their energy needs now. And in a couple of years, they won't need Russia anymore. I think NATO members are going to do hard sanction. The US is pushing for cutting Russia off from SWIFT, which would be the harshest economic sanction imaginable. That means that Russia is completely cut off from global finance. And even aside from that, just general trade sanctions would be devastating. But I mean, Putin doesn't give a shit about sanctions on his people, really. He doesn't give a shit about the welfare of Russians that much. His Kuro wouldn't have done this. So sanctions wouldn't even do anything to stop this. You think Putin is going to back off because you sanction him? No fucking way. Biden is surprisingly moderate in these sorts of things lately. It's surprising. It's also good. It's decent. He's much better than I thought he would be when it comes. I mean, he's still sanctioning Afghanistan, but it's very surprising that Biden is the voice of reason when it comes to sanctioning Russian civilians. When he basically has 80% of the American political mainstream yelling in his ear starve him, starve him. Biden is further left than fucking the online American left on that. That is sad. That is just sad. I don't want to actually make pronouncements regarding what's going on the ground here, because I feel that's irresponsible, because none of us really know what's going on. It's very difficult to confirm anything. There's no Hearts of Iron 4 map here that we can look at. I've heard so many different reports. There was a report of Odessa being invaded by sea, which is fucking insane. A sea landing in a major city. But apparently it didn't happen. From what I know, Odessa has since been invaded, but by land. But I can't even confirm that. I don't want to make any pronouncements, because I don't know what's going on there. No one knows what's going on there. A lot of streamers are just scrolling through Twitter right now and acting like they're journalists. No, you're not. There's so much conflicting information. I'm more inclined to trust the Ukrainian government than the Russians here, obviously. But still, you can't really confirm what they're saying. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if the Ukrainian Navy was destroyed, because it basically doesn't exist. There's no way it can face up to the Russian. This war is going to be an urban war once it actually truly begins. So far, doesn't really seem to have been much direct engagements, though there have been some. If they make it to Kiev, for example, or the cities that the Ukrainians are actually making their stands in, it's going to get fucking messy. It's going to be terrible. I mean, if you guys wanna tell me what you think Putin's motivations are, let me know, because I don't think this can be explained through any sort of rational interest, aside from just me want Ukraine, me take Ukraine, me no care. What else happened? Ooga booga. I mean, you say the NATO threat, but what is more of a threat to Russia? Being sanctioned to fuck, ruining itself diplomatically and geopolitically, or Ukraine being a member of NATO? The first is far worse for Russia than that, okay? So it doesn't make any sense. What would have been rational here from like Putin's general stance of like regional sort of irredentism would have been formally sending Russian troops into the breakaway republics, acknowledging their independence, and then annexing them, the same thing they did to Crimea. That would have at least made sense, because that's something they could have easily gotten away with. Them invading the rest of Ukraine and trying to install a puppet government, does not make sense, okay? They're not going to get away with that. I can't tell you about what's happening on the ground. None of us know what's happening on the ground. This is something that's only going to be pieced together after the fact. But I can tell you that this makes no fucking sense. The whole idea of like the rational world order, where countries are like regulate their geopolitical actions based on what they think they can get away with, doesn't apply to this. Because there's no way that Putin actually believes he can get away with this. You know, as much as I think that general sanctions on Russia that will affect the civilian population are wrong and should not happen, and that's a stance that any leftist should take, it's inevitable they're going to happen anyway, at least if he continues with this. And he's of course going to ignore them because he doesn't give a fucking shit about the welfare of Russians, but he knows that. He knows this is going to happen, so what is he doing? Honestly, Putin might just be fucking insane. He might have been insane this whole time and we just didn't realize it because he never really expressed the full fucking spectrum of his insanity. He's always been evil, but evil and insane are different things. And yeah, Putin was a completely different politician like 20 years ago. Putin used to like talk about how he wanted to install a pro-Pinochet dictator, like a Pinochet-style dictatorship in Russia that was pro-Western. And he also used to talk about how Ukraine has a right to self-determination. If it wants to join NATO, it should be allowed to. And yeah, he also wanted to join NATO himself. Like his politics have just completely flip-flopped in 20 years. He used to be like an authoritarian pro-West guy. Now he's like a fucking Duginist, honestly. Went from being a sort of pro-West, your typical pro-Western neoliberal authoritarian to like a completely insane and irrational irredentist. So it was in 1994 when Putin was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. He answered questions from representatives of German banks, and he said that he approves of preparations by Yeltsin and the military to bring about a Pinochet-style dictatorship in view of the difficult private economic path. And his remarks were received with friendly applause both by the German company representative and the deputy German consul general who was present. Holy shit, man! In like 2000, Putin said that Ukraine should be able to join NATO if it wants to. Yeah, I can't find it, but he did say that. And now he's like completely different. So yeah, I mean, obviously he has been influenced by probably like Duginists and shit and others in Russia who were far less pro-West than he was back then. But that happened a long time ago. He's been like this for at least 10 years at this point. So I don't think we can explain it through like some sort of shady behind the scenes shit. I think that this is how he is, and I mean, by Duginist, I don't mean literally like he's friends with Dugin, but he certainly has the same irredentist elements that Putin expresses today. Like, I guarantee you Dugin is very happy about Russia invading Ukraine. I mean, obviously there's no genocide in Eastern Ukraine. Give me a fucking break. There's no need to even talk about Putin's claims because they're all bullshit. And no one believes them, not even Russians. Give me a break. But the fact of the matter is, even from like a standpoint where Putin is an ultra-nationalist irredentist who wants to conquer all of Eastern Europe, this is bad for him. He's going to lose out here. Well, he personally isn't going to lose out, but Russia is going to lose out. And I have to assume that he cares about Russia's political power. So it just doesn't make sense. You can't explain this through realpolitik. I mean, I'm sure it's rational to him, but it's not rational to him in his usual way. We can usually explain what Putin does. The invasion of Georgia, for example. He did it because he knew that he could get away with it. The invasion of Crimea. He did it because he knew that he could get away with it. The support of separatists in Donbass. He did it because he knew that he could get away with it. The rest of it, less so. Just saying that, like, oh, it's because of NATO expansion. This is worse for Russia than NATO expansion to Ukraine would have been. Significantly worse. Ukraine, with like millions of people who have left, depopulated, where his rule or his rule of whoever his puppet is going to be incredibly unpopular and hated. In exchange for being completely cut off from the global economic system, from global trade, from alienating himself from his country's own geopolitical projects across the world. Like Argentina, for example, has denounced the invasion. When like a month ago, the two countries signed like memorandums of understanding and shit on forming a closer economic relationship. This isn't good for Ukraine. Obviously it's not good for Ukraine, but it's also not good for Russia. It doesn't make sense. And I think trying to explain it in any way other than Putin won Ukraine, Uga Buga, is just not really going to end anywhere. I mean, China doesn't want to literally invade Taiwan. It's also, invading Ukraine from Russia, that's already a pretty difficult task. Though I think I might have overestimated the organization of Ukraine's military, because in theory, obviously Ukraine's military is smaller than Russia's, but Ukraine should not be having too much trouble with an invasion of only about 200,000 Russian troops. In theory. I think in practice, they don't have any counter to Russian air power. So they're just getting their backline military targets are just getting fucking destroyed. And they just can't, their troops on the ground can't really hold up to Russian air dominance. I hope I'm wrong on that, but it just from like preliminary indications, that seems to be what's happening, because Russia is striking military targets very deep behind the front line. Even though in theory they have the military strength to like maybe hold Russia off at least, they just like the material just isn't there for them. Do I think SWIFT restrictions will be enacted? I hope not. From what I've seen, Italy and Germany are against SWIFT restrictions, and apparently they need to agree to it. And I think Biden also said he is against them, which makes him further to the left than most American leftists who are calling for SWIFT sanctions. But I mean, there's definitely going to be trade sanctions. And trade sanctions aren't as devastating as SWIFT sanctions, but I mean, you have to understand, SWIFT sanctions are a complete cutoff, not just from trade, but from the entire global financial system, not just the US. Oh yeah, Maupin's going all fucking in on like pro-Russia. I mean, Haz is too, but Haz is also, as you expect, Haz is like a joke. He's like a character. If he's a real person, I prefer to pretend he isn't. But Caleb Maupin sincerely believes this shit. Caleb Maupin's like posting on Twitter. Yeah, I mean, we got the serious shit over with there, I guess. But Caleb, let me talk about the joke shit. Caleb Maupin is like straight up supporting the invasion on Twitter. Straight up supporting it. Like straight up saying it's a good thing. And Jackson Hinkle was saying like that it's not happening. As Putin was literally saying, we are invading Ukraine. Jackson Hinkle was like, Russia is not invading you. That's a false flag attack. Fucking amazing. Like, yeah, like, this is I can't show you Caleb Maupin's actual tweets because he has me blocked, but this is something that he just retweeted, and it pretty much sums up his stance. This is not an inter-imperialist conflict. This is a conflict between NATO expansionism with Nazi support on one side and the national security of Donbass, Lugansk, and Russia on the other. Oh my god. I think I was actually wrong about Caleb Maupin. I think Maupin is not just like someone who is against the US no matter what. I think he's actually like a straight up Russian imperialist. An actual real Russian imperialist. And I don't think it's just because he's being paid to be such. I think it's because he actually is. And because he is that's why Russia pays him. And yeah, Caleb Maupin is literally reporting for RT throughout this. What the fuck is going on? What world do we live in? And yeah, I'm also sick of people like justifying this with the Nazi talking point. Like, yeah, Ukraine has lots of Nazis. And even if Ukraine was 100% full Nazi, even if they replace their country's flag with the Nazi flag tomorrow, they're still supported by the West, and the consequences for Russia are still going to be fucking massive, and that do not make them invading Ukraine at all rational in terms of their own self-interest. Ukraine isn't 100% Nazi. It is pretty Nazi. Sure, like 20% of Ukrainians are pretty fucking far right, okay? That's true. But so is Putin. The head of the fucking Wagner group is a neo-Nazi. There are also neo-Nazis in the Russian military and shit. To act like Putin is worried about Nazis, Motherfucker, Putin is closer to a Nazi than the average Ukrainian politician is, okay? Russia may not have literally integrated like the Azov battalion into their military, but that doesn't mean they're still not incredibly far right. And yeah, Wagner Group, who are, I believe, heavily involved in Syria and are obviously just a proxy of the Russian government, are led by a neo-Nazi, okay? It's true that I don't think Russia uses Wagner in Ukraine, but they're still happy to use neo-Nazis, okay? Obviously. So the Nazi talking point doesn't work. And even if it did, invading Ukraine is still a terrible fucking move. Even if it was morally correct, which it's not, because obviously Ukraine isn't 100% Nazi like these people are trying to say. Even if it was, it would still be awful for Russia because the West was still allied with them and it would work out awfully for them. Oh, so Wagner is involved in Ukraine. Yeah, I didn't know that. So that just... both sides are using Nazis, okay? Like, the idea that, like, these people have, it's essentially like they believe that Ukrainians are genetically fascist. Now, Ukraine has a huge problem with Nazism. Well, not so specifically with Nazism, I'd say. More like the whitewashing of Holocaust perpetrators. Stepan Bandera was a Holocaust perpetrator who wanted to ethnically cleanse Ukraine of all Poles, Jews, and Russians. And about 40% of Ukrainians have a positive image of him. That's a problem. But it's a problem for Ukraine to fucking deal with, not for fucking Vladimir Putin to deal with. It's a problem across Eastern Europe. Most Eastern European countries have this narrative of like the two genocide theory, where they were like them being like Soviet satellite states was just as bad as the Holocaust, which is obviously absurd. But that still doesn't mean that Russia should fucking invade Ukraine. The only reason why Russia doesn't agree with that is because Russia has integrated Stalin and Lenin into its nationalism. That's the only reason. Without that, Russia would basically believe the same thing. Like if there's anything that Putin wants, it's basically like a restoration of like the pre-USSR Russian Empire, but rather than having a monarchy, just him as a dictator. Trying to like compare him with like the USSR makes no sense at all because he's not a communist. He doesn't like the USSR. He was involved, you know, in the KGB and shit, but that doesn't mean that he was ideologically a communist or anything. The reason why Russian nationalists like Stalin but not so much Lenin is because Lenin gave up a lot of the territory of the Russian Empire.
Feels like he supports the Holocaust.
I mean, the only left position on this is NATO shouldn't interfere. Sanctions should be limited to like military stuff, perhaps individual sanctions on government figures, though the problem with that is that they have auxiliary effects. There's no evidence for Western intervention making something better, you know? If you look at it empirically, you look at the facts, what do they have for that? They have World War II, which is so far away and so different and so completely inapplicable that invoking it is ridiculous, especially since most Western countries did not intervene at all until they were forced to themselves. And then what do they have? They also bring up the Balkan Wars, which it's a bit more iffy there, whether their intervention escalated things or not. And then aside from that, they have nothing but a list of like dozens upon dozens upon dozens upon dozens of them fucking destroying and ruining countries and making things far worse. So the evidence for Western intervention into Ukraine possibly being a good thing isn't there. Aside from the fact that we're not talking about, you know, invading Afghanistan or Iraq here, we're talking about intervening in a conflict involving the world's primary nuclear power, because Russia has more nukes than the US. I'm pretty sure combined it has almost as many nukes as the US and Europe and Western Europe combined. So it's very different. Well, now what's going to happen is they're going to sanction it. But that shouldn't happen because you shouldn't fucking punish regular Russian civilians for the actions of Vladimir Putin, whose politics they cannot really meaningfully influence at all. That's just fucking collective punishment. And Putin isn't going to fucking care if you lower the living standards of the Russian people. He doesn't care about them. That's not how you leverage anything against him. Give me a fucking break. Left position is not when you support sanctions. It's not when you support the world's premier capitalist power, using its capitalist power against another weaker, though still capitalist imperial power, okay? That is not what leftism is. The left position here is to hope that Ukraine can hold the fucking Russians off, to help refugees, to do anything we can to, you know, help the victims of this fucking ridiculous war. But when it comes to like imperialist conflict, you don't fucking side with one cynical geopolitical power over another. It's all about them increasing their own imperialist power at the expense of another imperialist power. And when that is the conflict, you don't take a side. The only side you would take is that of the Ukrainian and to a lesser extent the Russian working class, because Russians are also going to be suffering here if the West implements the sanctions on them that it seems like it's going to. Suffering because of the fucking ridiculous nationalist bullshit of their far-right leader, who they have no power over, by the way. That's another thing too. A lot of the people who are going to be angry about this, they aren't really angry about it. What they're angry about is the fact that Russia doing this challenges the hegemony of the Western powers. You know, this is not something that you could have imagined happening like 25 years ago. Now, that doesn't mean that we should fucking support Russia just to make the libs mad. But we should absolutely point out the fact that they don't really care about this. What bothers them is the fact that another imperial power is contesting US imperial power. Not really in a real meaningful global way, but at least regionally. That doesn't mean it's a good thing that it's happening, but that's their motivation for being against it. If they actually cared about that, you know, they wouldn't have supported the fucking destruction of Yemen very recently, just for one example. Obviously. They wouldn't have sanctions on the Taliban, which are starving Afghans right now. This is not whataboutism, because we're talking about the motivations of the US here, and inconsistencies in the US's professed motivations are relevant when we're talking about their motivations, okay? I don't want to like use one person as an example, though. This does seem to me to sum up a lot of the sentiment here. Like some person literally who has ANCOM in their username. I said, you have ANCOM in your name. What the fuck is anarcho-communist about calling for a capitalist imperial power to attack the well-being of the Russian working class to get back at their geopolitical rival and the Russian bourgeoisie? That is fucking insane. And ANCOM responded to me. It's very anarcho-communist to be for sanctions. That is a phrase that no one should ever utter. Holy shit. Apparently anarchism is when you think that the US's control of the global financial system is a justified hierarchy and it should be able to leverage it as it pleases. Holy shit. It's very ANCOM to be for sanctions against Russia because the continued existence of the Russian state as it is right now is extremely harmful to the Russian people.
White rights, of course.
So like what? You have to like sanction Russian people, starve them to death, so that, I mean, I guess when they're all dead, there won't be a Russian state anymore, technically. So I guess this is like anarcho-primitivism sanction style. Anarcho-primitivism sanctionism. What the fuck is going on? Like, this needs to be minted as a fucking NFT. And of course they have fucking Proud Vorshite in there, but no, it's it must be a parody account. No, sorry, it's a 2-year-old account, it's not a parody account. Fuck! What is going on with these people, man? I didn't want to complain about them in this segment, but I can't help it.
Feels like he supports the Holocaust.
How do I talk about leftism when the people who think they're leftism aren't even remotely on the left and legitimately don't even understand their own professed ideologies even a little bit? It's impossible. I might be mean to anarchists sometimes, but that's not what anarchism is. That's not even remotely what anarchism is. What the fuck is going on here? I hope Ukraine manages to defend itself against Putin's imperialist fucking aggression. I don't want to say Russia's imperialist aggression because I really don't think that this is something that the Russian people at all have a real influence in. I really hope that they can push him back, and I also really hope this doesn't turn into a broader imperialist conflict. There's not really much else to say. I'm not going to make any pronouncements about what is going to happen because I don't know. My preliminary indications, as I said earlier, that it doesn't look good. But yeah, that's it on that topic for now.